My daughter chose her stepfather to walk her down the aisle on her wedding day, replacing me, the man who raised her alone. She begged for forgiveness later, but I made sure she learned a lesson she'd never forget. I was 46 years old, and for most of my adult life I had one mission: raising my daughter Emily. She had just turned 26, and for the better part of those years it was just her and me navigating the storms of life together. I had assumed that what we had built through sleepless nights, scraped knees, school plays, and shared laughter was unbreakable. But I learned the hard way that even the strongest bonds can be tested, especially when the past decides to claw its way back into your life. Emily's mother, Vanessa, left us when Emily was only 5. There was no big argument, no lead-up, no red flags that screamed something was wrong. One morning, she simply looked at me and said she needed space. And just like that, she was gone, disappeared, vanished from our lives like smoke in the wind. I didn't get answers, just the crushing weight of being abandoned and left to raise a child on my own. I later discovered the reasons for her sudden departure, but that's a tale for another moment. Just know that they had nothing to do with Emily or me and everything to do with Vanessa's own selfish decisions. In those first few months after she left, I was drowning. I had to figure out how to manage a full-time job while raising a heartbroken little girl who asked questions I didn't have the heart to answer. How do you explain to a kindergartner why her mom isn't there to tuck her in at night? I learned quickly. I became a master of packing lunches, fixing ponytails, organizing school schedules, and soothing nightmares. We made it work, even when money was tight and sleep was scarce. Emily was my everything. She was the reason I pushed through 12-hour shifts and the motivation behind every decision I made. Her smile lit up my darkest days, and I was there for all of it. Every doctor's appointment, every recital, every time she came home crying because someone was mean at school. I wiped her tears and told her she was strong, beautiful, and loved beyond measure. As she grew older, she naturally became more curious about her mother. Where is she, Dad? Why did she leave? Was it because of me? Those questions were like daggers to the heart. Every time, I reassured her, no, sweetheart, it wasn't your fault. Your mom loved you in her own way. She just had to go somewhere else. I bit my tongue and swallowed my bitterness. I never badmouthed Vanessa, even though I had every reason to. I figured Emily would piece the truth together one day on her own. And then, when Emily was 17, the past walked through my front door. It was a lazy Saturday afternoon. I was outside cutting the grass while Emily was holed up inside studying for a history test. The doorbell rang, and I assumed it was a neighbor or someone delivering a package. But when I opened the door, my stomach dropped. There stood Vanessa. Her appearance was polished, like someone who had just walked out of a luxury boutique. She carried an expensive handbag and wore a smile that didn't belong. She greeted me like we were old pals meeting for brunch. "James," she said, her tone light and casual, as if no time had passed and she hadn't shattered 2 lives. Before I could respond, Emily came down the stairs. She stopped cold at the sight of her mother. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Mom?" Vanessa's arms opened and Emily rushed into them. They held each other like a scene from a movie. Meanwhile, I stood in my own home, reduced to a bystander in the very life I had sacrificed so much to build. And it didn't stop there. Vanessa wasn't content with a surprise visit. She was there with a story to tell, one that painted her as the victim and me as the antagonist. Over the next several weeks, she and Emily became inseparable. They went on shopping trips, out to lunch, and spent hours talking. I didn't interfere. Emily deserved a relationship with her mother, no matter how late it started. But what I didn't expect was for Vanessa to manipulate that opportunity into a chance to rewrite history. She told Emily that she left because I was controlling, that life with me was unbearable. She claimed she stayed away for safety, not out of choice. The worst part? Emily started to believe it. Slowly, the questions crept in. Why didn't you let her try to find her dad? Why didn't you let her come back? Like I'd been standing guard keeping the door locked all these years. That wasn't all. Vanessa introduced Emily to her new husband, Greg. He was overly polite, always smiling, the kind of guy who seemed too rehearsed. Vanessa made him out to be a saint, the perfect stepfather, the man who was finally there to give Emily what I supposedly hadn't. It was a gut punch. I could feel the shift in Emily. She started seeing them as the ideal family, while I became the guy who paid the bills and kept the lights on. One day, she looked me in the eye and asked, "Mom said you didn't want her around. Is that true?" It was like being kicked in the chest. I stayed calm and told her the truth. "No, Emily, your mom left. I didn't stop her. I didn't even know where she went." She didn't argue. She just nodded, her expression unreadable. That hurt more than any accusation, seeing doubt in her eyes after everything we'd been through. Vanessa kept pushing her narrative. She and Greg became regular fixtures in Emily's life. Every time they picked her up, they acted like a perfect family unit, and I was the outsider watching it all from the sidelines. I told myself it was temporary, that Emily would remember the years we spent just the two of us, but it was getting harder to hold on to that hope. A few more years passed, and Emily met Ryan. He was everything a father could hope for: respectful, grounded, and genuinely kind. When she told me they were engaged, my heart swelled with pride. I thought maybe this was the moment we'd reconnect, that we'd plan her wedding together, reminisce about old times, and laugh over centerpieces and cake flavors. I remember thinking, maybe this wedding would bring back that father-daughter closeness we used to share. Maybe working on the seating chart together or discussing her vows would help bridge the emotional gap that had widened since Vanessa's return. I imagined those precious moments driving together to tour venues, giving her advice on song choices for the reception, maybe even getting a little choked up when she tried on dresses. I thought I'd walk her down the aisle, not just as a formality, but as the man who had always been there. Instead, those wedding plans became a slow, painful unveiling of just how much I'd been sidelined. Emily talked more about Greg's opinions than mine. Vanessa had her fingerprints on every detail, from the guest list to the menu. And me? I felt like I was being humored, included just enough so it wouldn't look bad, but excluded from every real decision. And the final blow, when the time came to discuss who would walk Emily down the aisle, she looked me in the eyes and said, "I want Greg to do it." I stood there, stunned. My hands went numb. For a moment, I thought I misheard. I asked her, "Are you saying you want your stepdad to walk you down the aisle instead of me?" She hesitated. I think it would mean a lot to Mom. And Greg has been really supportive these past few years. You're still invited, Dad, of course. I want this. That wasn't just a knife in the heart, it was the whole damn cutlery set. I didn't scream. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I simply nodded and left. If she truly believed that the man who showed up after all the hard work was the one worthy of that honor, then maybe she needed to see what life without me looked like. Maybe she needed to learn what loyalty really meant, and that lesson was coming. I truly believed I'd have a central role in my daughter's wedding. I mean, why wouldn't I? I raised her practically on my own, through all the storms, scraped knees, and school projects. Walking her down the aisle was something I had always pictured in my mind, a moment that would symbolize everything we'd been through together. At first, it even seemed like things were heading in that direction. Emily asked for my input on the guest list, ran venue options by me, and seemed genuinely happy to have me involved. I offered to help cover some of the costs, not because I had a fortune tucked away, but because I had saved a little over the years, and I thought it would be a meaningful gesture. Of course, lurking in the background of every conversation was Vanessa. She hovered, inserting herself here and there, offering her opinions on the flower arrangements, the catering, and even suggesting tweaks to Emily's wedding dress. At first, I tried to keep my cool. I figured it wasn't my place to tell Emily who she should or shouldn't listen to. She's an adult, but soon enough Vanessa wasn't just making suggestions, she was slowly positioning herself as the heart of the operation. Every time I turned around, Vanessa was throwing out ideas. "Greg and I know an incredible photographer," she'd say, like they were planning their own second wedding. Or, "Greg's buddy owns a stunning venue, we could probably get a discount." Emily seemed genuinely enthusiastic about all of it, which stung, but I kept my mouth shut. I reminded myself this was her day, not mine. Everything shifted one evening when Emily and I went out to dinner. It was supposed to be a casual father-daughter catch-up, the kind we used to have when she was in high school. We chose this little diner we'd gone to countless times before, a spot that carried a lot of our shared memories. I was feeling nostalgic. We were halfway through our burgers when she hit me with it. "Dad, I've been thinking about the ceremony," she said, eyes downcast as she toyed with the fries on her plate. I smiled, assuming she wanted advice on music or something. "Yeah, what about it?" She took a slow breath, then said it. "I think I want Greg to walk me down the aisle." I froze. My fork stopped midway to my mouth. I stared at her, waiting for her to laugh and say she was joking. "Greg?" I repeated, trying to keep the tremble out of my voice. She nodded, still not meeting my eyes. "He's been such a big part of my life these last few years, and Mom thinks it would be really meaningful." There it was, the magic words, "Mom thinks." Of course she did. I could practically see Vanessa standing behind her, whispering the idea into her ear. I was stunned. I didn't know what to say. This was supposed to be my moment, my reward for decades of dedication, sleepless nights, and unconditional love. I had been there for every milestone, every heartbreak, every celebration. And now, she wanted Greg, a man who hadn't entered her life until adulthood, to take that moment from me. "Okay," I finally said, forcing my voice to remain calm and even. Emily visibly relaxed, like she had expected me to argue or get angry. "It's not about replacing you," she said quickly. "It's just, I think it would mean a lot to everyone." Not about replacing me. What exactly was it about them? The rest of the meal was a blur. I think I mumbled some things about how good the food was. I nodded a lot, but inside I was furious, hurt, betrayed. How could she not see how deeply that decision cut me? When I got home that night, I sat in the dark and replayed every memory I had of raising her. I searched for signs, moments I might have failed her, maybe left her feeling unloved or unsupported, but none of it added up. I had been there, always. This wasn't about something I had done wrong. This was about Vanessa. She had been planting these seeds since the moment she reappeared. Slowly and methodically, she'd rewritten our story, casting herself as the misunderstood mother and Greg as the knight who rescued her daughter's life. And somehow, Emily had bought it. The next morning, I made a decision. If I wasn't important enough to walk my daughter down the aisle, then I certainly wasn't going to bankroll a wedding that diminished my role in her life. I called Emily and laid it out plainly. Look, Emily, I love you. I want you to have the wedding you've dreamed of, but I can't financially support something that pushes me aside like this. I hope you understand. She didn't argue. She just said, I understand, in this soft, distant voice that made me feel like I was the villain. But what did they expect? That I'd smile through the pain and happily cut a check while Greg got to be the hero in a story I wrote with sweat and sacrifice? Of course, Vanessa couldn't resist the urge to jump in. A few days later, she called me, her tone syrupy sweet. James, I heard you're not helping with the wedding anymore. Emily's really upset. Yeah, well, maybe she should have thought about that before asking Greg to take my place, I snapped. Oh, don't be so dramatic, she replied with a sigh, like I was some tantrum-throwing child. This isn't about you. It's about making everyone feel included. I laughed bitterly. Everyone but the man who actually raised her, right? She exhaled like she was already bored with the conversation. You're making this harder than it needs to be. Can't you just be happy for her? Happy? From the woman who vanished without a second thought and came back just in time to orchestrate a narrative that pushed me out of my daughter's life? I hung up before I said something I'd regret. From that point on, things between Emily and me grew tense. She barely called, and when she did, the conversations felt obligatory, stilted. It was clear Vanessa and Greg were now the stars of her world, and I was little more than a fading background character. I tried telling myself to respect her choice, that it was her day, her decision, but the truth gnawed at me. I wasn't just being excluded from the wedding, I was being replaced in her life. After the dinner and the call with Vanessa, something in me shifted. I stopped bending over backward to keep the peace. I stopped pretending everything was fine. At first I thought maybe Emily would reconsider. Maybe she'd understand how much this was hurting me and change her mind, but no. If anything, she leaned in even more. And that's when I knew I wasn't just losing a role in her wedding. I was losing my place in her story altogether. I spent the next few days trying to carry on with life as usual, going to work, making dinner, folding laundry, but everything felt off. I couldn't shake the disappointment, the feeling of being cast aside by the very person I had sacrificed so much for. The silence from Emily didn't help either. Every time my phone buzzed, I hoped it would be her calling to talk, maybe even to say she'd changed her mind, but those calls never came. Instead, I started hearing updates secondhand through mutual friends, through social media. Vanessa was tagged in photos at bridal shops, Greg was praised in captions about supportive father figures, and me? I wasn't mentioned, not once. I had become invisible. People say weddings are supposed to bring families together. In my case, it was the final wedge that split us apart. I realized then that the damage wasn't temporary. This wasn't just about a walk down the aisle. It was about identity, about who got to be recognized for loving and raising Emily. And no matter how much I had done, somehow, I wasn't the one she saw standing at the end of that aisle. It was a harsh truth, but one I couldn't ignore any longer. Something shifted in Emily. She wasn't outright rude, but there was a coldness in the way she spoke, a distance in how she acted. The warmth we used to share, the easy, effortless conversations were gone. Now, when we spoke, it felt like she was performing politeness out of obligation, just enough to keep things civil, and that hurt more than I cared to admit. One day, I gave her a call just to check in. That used to be our routine. Hey Em, how's everything going? I asked, trying to keep my tone upbeat. It's fine, she answered quickly, her voice clipped. I'm really busy with wedding stuff. See anything you need help with, I offered, already knowing what she'd say. No, Mom and Greg are handling most of it. Of course they were. I bit my tongue and kept the disappointment out of my voice. If she didn't want my help unless it involved my wallet, then fine. I wasn't going to beg for the scraps of a relationship I had once carried on my shoulders. But deep down, I felt like I had already lost her. This wasn't about just a ceremony anymore. It was about my place in her life. Vanessa, unsurprisingly, was thriving in all of this. She made little comments, passive-aggressive jabs wrapped in sugary tones. "Oh, Greg is so excited to be such an important part of Emily's big day," she'd chirp. Or, "Emily's been really leaning on Greg lately. It's brought them even closer." I wanted to snap, to tell her to shut the hell up. But I didn't. I knew better. Vanessa had a way of twisting everything into a sob story where she was always the victim. If I exploded, she'd spin it into more proof that I was bitter and toxic. She was an expert manipulator. The breaking point came when I found out through my sister Laura, not Emily, that Vanessa and Greg had essentially taken over the entire wedding. Emily hadn't even told me about most of the major decisions. I wasn't being consulted, I wasn't even being informed. I felt like a ghost. Laura, still trying to play the neutral peacemaker, mentioned it one day in passing. Emily told me she's having Mom and Greg sit at the head table with her and Ryan. "What about me?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. "You'll be at the family table with the other relatives," Laura said gently, like she was breaking bad news to a child. It stung, it really did, but it got worse. Emily told Laura she didn't think I should give a speech at the wedding. "It'd be awkward," she said. "Since Greg's walking me down the aisle, we don't want it to seem like Dad's overshadowing him." Overshadowing him? Are you kidding me? The man didn't even enter her life until she was nearly grown, and now I was being told I had to sit silently, so I wouldn't eclipse a guy who hadn't even been there when she lost her first tooth? Then came the final insult. Laura mentioned again, as delicately as she could, that Vanessa and Emily had been talking about leaving my name off the wedding program completely. No father of the bride, no acknowledgement, just Vanessa and Greg front and center. That was when I realized this wasn't just sidelining, it was erasure. They weren't just ignoring me, they were actively writing me out of the story. And if that's how they wanted it, fine. I wasn't going to sit there, plaster on a smile, and watch some man who had barely known my daughter be celebrated in a role I had earned over 26 years. I wasn't going to toast to a moment that felt like a betrayal. I spent a couple of days weighing my options. Could I go, swallow the pain, and fake my way through it just to keep the peace? Maybe. But every time I imagined myself sitting there, watching Greg escort Emily down the aisle while I clapped politely from the background, my stomach turned. The anger simmered just below the surface. I had been there for it all, every heartbreak, every accomplishment, every tear. Vanessa was the one who disappeared. Greg didn't even know Emily existed until she was almost grown. And now I was supposed to act like none of that mattered? No, I couldn't do it. I made my decision. I wasn't going to the wedding. When I told Laura, she was not thrilled. "James, she's your daughter," she said, exasperated. "You'll regret not being there." "No, Laura," I replied firmly. "What I'd regret is sitting there watching Greg do what I should be doing. This isn't about pettiness. It's about respect, and Emily's made it clear I don't have any in this situation." Laura sighed. I could tell she didn't agree, but she understood. "I get it. But don't you think not going just gives Vanessa and Greg the narrative? Like you're handing them the villain role on a silver platter?" She wasn't wrong, but I wasn't about to let them weaponize my silence either. "They're going to twist it no matter what I do," I told her. "At least this way I'm not pretending everything's okay." And oh, did they twist it. As soon as Vanessa caught wind of my decision, the phone call started. First, she tried the concerned co-parent angle. "James, are you seriously not coming? Do you realize how much this will hurt Emily?" "She's the one who chose to hurt me, Vanessa," I said calmly. "I'm just responding to her decision." "Don't be ridiculous," she snapped, the syrup gone from her voice. "This isn't about you, it's about Emily and her big day." "I know exactly what it's about," I shot back. "It's about you and Greg taking over, just like you've been trying to do since you slithered back into her life. I'm not playing your game." That's when she dropped the act completely. Manipulation kicked in. "If you don't come, everyone's going to see what kind of father you really are," she hissed. "You're going to embarrass Emily in front of all her guests." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because I'd heard it all before. "Oh, Vanessa, you've been painting me as the villain for years. Don't act like this is something new. If Emily's embarrassed, maybe she should think about why I feel the way I do." She didn't like that answer. She hung up. And I sat there in the silence, knowing I'd made the right choice. That night, I stared at old photo albums, snapshots of birthdays, school plays, lazy Sunday mornings, me helping Emily learn to ride her bike, me holding her hand during her first doctor's visit. All those memories, all that love. You don't just erase that because someone new showed up with a shiny smile and good timing. I realized then that I wasn't angry just because I was being left out of the wedding. I was angry because I was losing my daughter to a version of history that wasn't even real. A version where Vanessa was the guiding mother and Greg the shining father figure. A version that conveniently forgot who was there when it actually mattered. And if Emily didn't want to acknowledge that, if she was okay with turning the page and leaving me off it entirely, then fine, I'd walk away with my dignity intact. Even if it broke my heart in the process. But I knew deep down that it wasn't truly over, not yet. I had braced myself for the fallout, and sure enough, Emily called a few days later. She wasn't aggressive like Vanessa, but the irritation in her voice was undeniable. "Dad," she began, skipping any greeting, "what's this about you not coming to the wedding?" I took a breath, steadying myself. "Emily, I've thought about this long and hard. I just can't go. I can't sit there and watch someone else take my place. It's not fair to me." Her tone immediately sharpened. "It's not about replacing you. I've told you that already. Greg's been important to me too." I tried to stay calm. "And what about me, Emily? Where do I fit in? You've made so many decisions that push me out. Now you want me to just show up and clap from the sidelines? That's not something I can do." She sighed loudly, frustration clear. "I'm just trying to make everyone happy, Dad. Why do you have to make this so difficult?" "I'm not making it difficult," I said firmly. "I'm standing up for myself. You made a choice, and this is mine." That didn't sit well with her. She muttered something about me being selfish and abruptly hung up. I sat in silence, phone still in my hand, staring at the wall. But I didn't cave. I couldn't. That's when the real campaign began. Vanessa took it upon herself to inform every family member she could reach that I was abandoning Emily on her big day. Suddenly, I was getting phone calls from cousins, uncles, even an aunt I hadn't spoken to in over a decade. "James, come on," one cousin said gently. "It's just one day. Don't let this ruin your relationship with Emily." "It's not just one day," I replied. "It's the culmination of years of manipulation. Vanessa's been twisting the story for so long. This wedding is just the final chapter." Even my mother weighed in, and although she meant well, her words stung deeply. "Honey, you've always been such a good father. Don't let this be the thing Emily remembers." I kept my voice steady. "Mom, she's the one who decided to cut me out. I'm not going to stand there and pretend everything's fine while she and Vanessa pretend I don't exist." No matter how much pressure they put on me, I stood my ground. I knew the version of the story they were hearing wasn't the whole truth. Vanessa had always had a gift for spinning things her way, and Emily, whether knowingly or not, had become her echo. In the days leading up to the wedding, it felt like everyone around me had a script I wasn't part of. Strangers at work, neighbors, acquaintances, they all assumed I'd be there, beaming with pride. They'd say things like, "You must be so excited," or "Big day coming up." I just smiled tightly and nodded, not wanting to invite more questions or judgment. On the day of the wedding, I stayed home. I didn't want to be anywhere near the festivities. Instead, I busied myself with mindless chores, organizing the garage, sorting old tools, cleaning the kitchen. Anything to distract me from what was happening. That evening, Laura texted me, "Well, you missed quite the show." "What happened?" I asked, only half curious. She replied, "Vanessa gave this long speech about how Greg stepped up to be a father figure, not one single word about you." I wasn't surprised. It still stung. "Figures," I texted back. Despite all of it, I didn't regret staying away. Being at that wedding would have felt like being slowly peeled apart. Watching Greg walk my daughter down the aisle, hearing a speech that erased my existence, I couldn't have endured it. At least by staying home, I preserved some sense of dignity. Let Vanessa and Emily craft their version of reality. I knew the truth. Sometimes, the only way to protect yourself is to walk away, even if it breaks your heart. In the weeks that followed, I found myself reflecting on everything. I kept asking one question. If Emily could so easily sideline me now, what did that mean for the future? What if this wasn't just a wedding day issue? What if over the years I slowly faded from her life until I was nothing more than a blurry figure in the background? The thought haunted me. It wasn't just about being cut from one day late. It was about the possibility of being erased from the rest of her life. That's when I made a decision. It wasn't done out of revenge, but out of self-preservation. I called my attorney the next morning. "I want to change my will," I told him. "I'm removing Emily as my beneficiary." Instead, I named two recipients, a children's charity I supported for years, and my sister Laura. My lawyer raised an eyebrow but said nothing judgmental. He asked the usual questions, probably checking that I wasn't acting purely out of emotion. I explained calmly, "Emily has chosen someone else to fill that role in her life. I'm just making it official." It was a straightforward process, but as I walked out of his office, I felt a strange mix of emotions, relief and grief intertwined. On one hand, I felt empowered, like I had finally drawn a boundary no one could ignore. On the other, I mourned the vision I had always held close, the one where I grew old watching Emily thrive, where I was part of her world, her family, her joy. I assumed the change would stay private, at least until after I was gone, but somehow word got out just days later. I have a strong suspicion that Laura, despite her best intentions, let it slip. She insists she didn't. Either way, the damage was done. Emily called me, her voice laced with anger and betrayal. "Dad, what the hell is this about you cutting me out of your will?" No greeting, no warmth. I sighed, already tired. "I think you already know why, Emily." There was a long pause on the line. I could hear her breathing, maybe trying to rein in whatever she was feeling before she spoke again. "So this is it?" she asked quietly. "You're just cutting me off?" I hesitated, not because I didn't know the answer, but because I hated that it had come to this. "I'm not punishing you," I said carefully. "I'm protecting myself. I spent 26 years giving you everything I had, and when it came time for a moment that should have belonged to both of us, you gave it away. That wasn't just a decision, that was a message." "I didn't mean for it to come across like that," she murmured, her tone softening just slightly. "I know you didn't mean it to," I replied, "but it still did. I didn't expect perfection. I just wanted to feel like I mattered. And I didn't." There was nothing else to say after that. She mumbled something about needing time to think and hung up. I sat there, the phone resting silently in my hand, knowing that we just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. In the days that followed, I kept going through the motions, working, cooking, mowing the lawn, but something inside me had shifted permanently. The hardest part wasn't the anger, it was the sense of finality. That feeling you get when you know a chapter of your life is closed for good, no matter how much you love the story. I didn't tell anyone else about the will change. I didn't make a show of it. This wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming the part of myself that had been trampled under the weight of years of sacrifice and emotional neglect. And maybe, someday, Emily will look back and understand why I did what I did. Maybe she'll see that I wasn't trying to hurt her. I was finally choosing to stop being hurt. Until then, I'll live with the consequences of that choice, quietly, resolutely, with my dignity intact. Because sometimes the only way to love yourself is to stop letting the people you love hurt you. And that's exactly what I did. "No, I don't," she snapped over the phone. "You're just doing this to punish me, aren't you?" "Not at all," I said, my tone measured and calm. "This isn't about punishment. It's about boundaries. You made your choice, Emily, now I'm making mine." There was a long pause on the other end. Then her voice returned, defensive and strained. "You're being ridiculous. You're my dad. Just because I included Greg doesn't mean you don't matter to me." "Actions speak louder than words," I replied. "You didn't just include Greg. You gave him the role that should have been mine. You made it clear who you see as your father when it counted most. And I'm choosing to respect that decision by stepping back." Her voice trembled, and I could tell the tears were right there under the surface. "So that's it? You're just cutting me off completely?" "No," I answered, keeping my voice steady. "Let's call it something else. I'm drawing a line. I've spent years putting you first, Emily, giving, supporting, sacrificing, but I won't keep doing that if you don't value it." She didn't say much after that, a few muttered words about how unfair I was being, and then she hung up. For days, I expected the phone to ring again. I half hoped she'd call back with a change of heart, or at least a willingness to talk things through, but silence was all I got. What I did get, though, was a new wave of judgment from extended family. Apparently, Vanessa had taken my decision and spun it into her own narrative, one that painted me as the cruel, heartless father who abandoned his daughter out of spite. Family members I hadn't heard from in years started calling to guilt-trip me back into line. "James, really," one of my uncles said, "it's just a wedding. You're going to let this destroy your relationship with Emily?" "It's not just a wedding," I told him. "It's a pattern. It's years of manipulation and erasure. This is just the moment that finally broke me." Even my mother weighed in, her voice kind but disappointed. "Honey, you've always been such a good dad. Don't let this be the memory Emily holds on to." "She's the one who cut me out, Mom," I said, biting back the emotion in my throat. "I'm not going to sit through a celebration where I'm treated like an afterthought." Still, no one seemed to want to hear my side. They had already absorbed Vanessa's version of events, and nothing I said seemed to matter. But for the first time in years, I didn't care. I finally felt like I was standing up for myself, and it felt strange but right. About a week later, I got one last call from Emily. Her voice was calm but cold, colder than I'd ever heard it before. "I just want to know one thing," she said flatly. "Do you even care about me at all anymore?" My heart sank, but I didn't waver. "Of course I care about you, Emily. I always will. But caring about you doesn't mean letting you treat me like I don't matter. Something broke between us, something big. And fixing that, it would take time, effort, and honesty. Maybe even years." She didn't have much to say after that. She muttered a sarcastic "thanks for being honest" and ended the call. Cutting ties with her wasn't easy. For weeks after that conversation, I kept questioning myself, wondering if I'd overreacted. Had I been too harsh? Was I wrong to draw that boundary? But every time I replayed everything in my mind, I returned to the same truth. I had to protect myself. If Emily couldn't recognize the love and commitment I had poured into raising her, then I couldn't keep giving from a well that was already dry. I'd given her everything, and now it was time to take care of what little was left of me. I figured they'd move on, continue crafting their fairy tale narrative, and I'd move on with my quiet life. What I didn't expect was for everything Vanessa had built to start unraveling, and for it to happen so publicly. It all began with Laura, my sister. She'd stayed out of it for months, trying her best to remain neutral to keep the peace. But something in her snapped after watching how I was treated. "James," she said one afternoon over coffee, "I can't keep quiet anymore. Vanessa has been going around smearing you to everyone who'll listen. It's disgusting." I shook my head. "Laura, it's not worth it. Don't drag yourself into the mess." But she was resolute. "It is worth it. You've been the bigger person for too long. Emily's been drinking the Kool-Aid, and if someone doesn't set the record straight, she'll never know the truth." I didn't stop her. Part of me wanted the truth to finally see the light of day. The turning point came at a family gathering at Laura's house. Vanessa wasn't there, thank God, but Emily showed up, smiling and chatting like everything was normal. Laura had been holding back for so long, and seeing Emily act like nothing had happened was the last straw. "So Emily," Laura said, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear, "do you really believe all that nonsense your mom's been feeding you about why she left?" Emily froze, visibly startled. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about how your mom's been running around telling everyone that your dad was controlling, that he drove her away." Emily's expression shifted, unsure and uncomfortable. "That's what Mom told me." "Well, she lied," Laura snapped. "You want to know the real reason Vanessa left? It wasn't because of James. It was because she had an affair and got pregnant. She left because she couldn't handle the fallout. She vanished because she didn't want to face what she'd done." The room went dead silent. You could hear a pin drop. Emily's face turned pale. "That's not true," she said, barely audible. "It is true," Laura replied, unwavering. "Ask her. Ask Vanessa where she was those first few years after she left. Ask her about the baby she gave up for adoption. Your dad stayed. He raised you. He never once badmouthed her because he didn't want to destroy your image of her. And this is how you repay him?" Emily stood there, frozen, her mouth slightly open like she wanted to respond, but no words would come. I wasn't there to witness the moment firsthand, but Laura called me later to recount everything. "I'm sorry, James," she said. "I know it wasn't my place, but I couldn't keep quiet anymore." Emily needed to hear the truth. "Don't apologize," I told her. "You did what I never could." That night, I sat by myself in the living room, staring at the soft glow of a lamp that barely lit the room. I couldn't help but think about how different things might have been if Vanessa had just been honest, if Emily had asked the right questions, if I had spoken up sooner. But life rarely offers the luxury of what-ifs. Laura's courage gave me a strange kind of closure, not because it fixed everything, far from it, but because for the first time someone else stood up for me. Someone else said out loud what I had kept buried for years, and that meant more than I could ever express. In the end, maybe that's what family is supposed to do, not just share the good moments but also stand beside you when the world insists on twisting the truth. Maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as alone as I thought. I didn't know what would happen next with Emily. Maybe she'd come back one day. Maybe she'd confront Vanessa, or maybe she'd retreat further into her story, too hurt or too proud to admit she'd been wrong. But whatever came, I was ready. I had finally chosen myself. And that, in the quiet of that long and painful journey, was enough. When I finally told Emily it was about time someone said the truth out loud, the impact was immediate. She didn't waste a moment confronting Vanessa head-on, demanding answers. Of course, Vanessa did what manipulators always do first. She denied everything, swore up and down that it was all lies, fabricated to poison Emily against her. But the thing about lies is that they have short legs. They can only carry someone so far before they start to crumble under their own weight, especially when people start poking holes in the story. Apparently, Greg had overheard one of the heated arguments between Vanessa and Emily. But when he heard the word affair slip from Emily's lips, it all came crashing down. "You mean to tell me you had an affair, and a child?" he reportedly shouted during one of their explosive fights. "And you never told me any of it?" "It's not like that," Vanessa yelled back, trying to regain control. "That was years ago. It doesn't matter anymore." "It matters to me," Greg fired back. "You've been lying to me this whole time. How the hell am I supposed to trust you now?" The argument didn't last much longer. Greg packed his things and left within days. Vanessa tried to spin it, telling everyone Greg couldn't handle the truth and abandoned her because he was weak. But by then, her stories had lost their traction. People were beginning to see through the glittery facade she'd worn for so long. Even Emily, who'd been so firmly under Vanessa's influence, started showing cracks in her resolve. She stopped calling and texting me altogether. But Laura, my ever-loyal sister, kept tabs. "She's really shaken," Laura said one night. "She doesn't know what to believe anymore. Everything Vanessa told her, it's unraveling. She's starting to realize just how much she bought into." I wanted to say I felt vindicated. I should have. After all the accusations, the silence, the heartbreak, this was the moment of truth. But instead, I just felt a deep, aching sadness. I never wanted Emily to suffer. I only wanted her to see the truth before it came to this. But some people need to hit rock bottom before they can even begin to rebuild. Vanessa, true to form, went into full damage control mode. She called everyone family, friends, acquaintances, anyone who would listen. She tried to reframe the narrative again, painting herself as misunderstood, betrayed by those closest to her. But the more she talked, the worse it got. People could see the cracks now. They were tired of the lies, tired of the manipulation. Some of Vanessa's closest friends. Emily didn't reach out to me, not right away. But I knew, through Laura and others, that she had heard everything. Whether she believed it yet, I couldn't say. I wasn't holding out hope for an apology or even a conversation. But I did hope she was doing some real thinking. That she was sitting with the weight of it all. I kept to myself in the weeks that followed. I busied myself with work, small home repairs, cooking meals for one. I thought I was making progress, that I was finally coming to peace with everything. Until, out of the blue, there was a knock on my door. When I opened it, there she was, Emily. She looked different, worn down. Her eyes were puffy, and there were dark circles underneath them. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. For a fleeting second, that old protective instinct kicked in. I almost reached out, almost invited her in with a hug. But then I remembered everything. The wedding, the speech, the program, Greg. "Hi, Dad," she said softly. I leaned against the doorframe, keeping my expression neutral. "Emily, what are you doing here?" "I wanted to talk," she said, her voice shaky. "Please." I let out a slow breath. Part of me wanted to shut the door. Part of me, the part that remembered rocking her to sleep as a baby, couldn't do it. "All right," I said, stepping aside. She sat down on the couch. I stayed standing, arms crossed, waiting. "What's this about?" I asked. She looked down at her hands, fingers twisting nervously. "I've been thinking about everything. The wedding, Mom, the way I treated you." I didn't say a word. I let her sit in the silence. "I know I screwed up," she continued. "I let Mom get in my head. I didn't stop to think about how much it was hurting you. I made you feel like you didn't matter, and that was never what I wanted." Her words lingered in the air, and though I'd waited years to hear her admit it, they didn't feel as satisfying as I imagined. Not after everything. "Why now, Emily?" I finally asked. "Why are you here now, after all that's happened?" She looked up, eyes glossy with tears. "Because I'm sorry. I know I can't take it back, but I want to make it right. I want to fix this." I let out a short, bitter laugh. "Fix this? Emily, this isn't something you just fix with an apology. You didn't just hurt me, you replaced me. You made it clear that Greg and Vanessa were your priority, and now that it's all falling apart, you want to come back and pretend it never happened?" "That's not what I'm saying," she whispered, her voice cracking. I miss you. I miss us." I shook my head, the exhaustion finally overtaking the anger. "I spent 26 years putting you first, Emily. I gave you everything I had. And when it came time for you to give even a little back, to show some loyalty, you chose them. Do you even understand what that felt like?" She didn't answer, just wipe at her face as the tears came faster. I'm glad you're starting to see the truth about Vanessa, I continued. But this isn't just about her. This is about trust, Emily, and I don't know if I can ever trust you again. Her shoulders sank like all the air had gone out of her. She looked like she wanted to melt into the couch and disappear. So, that's it? She asked, barely above a whisper. I sighed, running a hand down my face. She didn't say anything else, just sat there with her head bowed, shoulders hunched, the room heavy with everything unsaid between us. Look, I said after a long silence, this isn't me slamming the door forever. I'm not saying I'll never forgive you, but forgiveness doesn't come just because someone says it comes with time, with effort, with honesty. She nodded slowly, tears streaking silently down her cheeks. If you want to rebuild this relationship, I continued, it's going to take more than one visit. It's going to take showing up for me, not just when things fall apart, but consistently, like I showed up for you. I understand, she said hoarsely. I didn't respond right away. I just stood there, watching her, wondering if this was finally the beginning of healing or just another chapter in a long story of heartbreak. I didn't have the answer, but I knew one thing for sure. This time, I wasn't going to lose myself to someone else's decisions ever again. I don't know what the future holds, Emily, I said quietly, the weight of years pressing down on my chest, but right now, I need space. I need time to heal. And I can't do that with you in my life, not yet. She didn't respond right away. She just sat there, motionless, her expression a tangle of guilt, sadness, and regret. For a moment, it looked like she might try to argue, to fight for some kind of middle ground, but instead she gave the smallest nod, her eyes shining with tears that she didn't bother to wipe away. I understand, she whispered, almost too softly to hear. I walked her to the door. The silence between us was heavy, but not angry, just tired, like two people who had run out of words. As she stepped outside, she paused and turned to face me one last time. I really am sorry, Dad, she said, her voice cracking. I hope one day you can forgive me. I didn't say anything. There was nothing left to say. I just gave her a small nod in acknowledgement, not acceptance, and then slowly closed the door behind her. Vanessa, meanwhile, was dealing with her own well-deserved consequences. Word spread that Greg had officially filed for divorce. Most of the family, once fooled by her charm and half-truths, had started to distance themselves. She was alone now, facing the consequences of the lies she'd spun for years, and honestly, I didn't care. She created the mess. Now she could live in it. I'm not going to pretend it's been easy. There are days when the quiet of the house feels more like a void than peace. Days when I think back to who Emily used to be, before Vanessa re-entered our lives and upended everything. I miss that version of her, the one who used to laugh with me over burnt pancakes and fall asleep on my shoulder during movie nights. But I've come to understand that healing sometimes means walking away, even from the people you love, even from your own child. Maybe someday Emily and I will find our way back to each other, maybe not, but for now, I'm at peace with my choice. I've spent too much of my life giving to people who didn't value me. It's time I finally choose myself.